Good afternoon, Smudger, and thank you for having this conversation with us. My name is Anne-Lise. I'm director at ARPAS-UK, and I'm very delighted to have you on this Fireside Chat to discuss drone BVLOS operations and airspace segregation. So I know you know a lot on the subject, but why don't you introduce yourself and explain where you're coming from, what's your background in relation to our topic?
Thanks, Anne-Lise. So good afternoon. So I'm Smudger Smith, referred to by most people just as Smudger, which is good for me. I've spent most of my career in military ATM, air traffic and air operations, mainly in the Royal Navy. And fundamentally, that has put me into a good position 2 years ago where I joined Black Swan as an aviation consultant and pretty much thrown straight into the deep end in creating airspace for BVLOS operations, mainly on Project 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗧. And that introduction to BVLOS and the airspace change proposal process has been painful, but actually very informative, and I've learned an awful lot within the last 2 years. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. So I've had 11 ACPs for BVLOS TDAs approved over the last 18 months, 2 years. As I say, on Project 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗧, working for FlyLogix, who operate over the North Sea, doing methane measurements and other areas. So in answer to the question, Alice, is that all that has given me a really good grounding and understanding now of, or a better understanding of airspace within the UK and how the CA see that being implemented in moving towards, hopefully, the full integration of BVLOS into UK airspace.
Okay, good. So talking to the right person here, maybe can I ask you to explain in very plain English what are the different forms of segregations? Because we hear a lot about TDA, TSA, TRA, TMZ, etc. But I'm not so sure many people understand exactly what it is. So, can you walk us through each of those and maybe try and identify what's the difference between one and the other?
Yeah, sure. So, and you're right, it is a bit of a minefield. There's no doubt about it. In terms of TDA, TRA, and TSA, for example, they come under the generic heading of special use airspace, for which the CA have a very good policy in terms of how that's implemented. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then TMZ fits in with radio mandatory zone and comes under a slightly different heading because it's not about airspace segregation in that case. It's about different methods of hopefully enhancing air traffic management in less complex areas, I think it's best to say. So I'll come back to TMZ as well. So in terms of special use airspace, there's a dozen types of different airspace, but we'll concentrate on TDA, TRA and TSA. So temporary danger area fundamentally is airspace that's there to protect other airspace users from whatever hazardous activity is going on within it. And apologies, that also applies to danger area as opposed to in addition to danger area. Normally that is used for military danger areas where clearly lots of kinetic effects are going on, and therefore you don't want to be flying through those areas. So airspace is created around them to protect other airspace users. And those sorts of hazardous activities. And that includes aircraft flying not following the rules of the air, but within in a defined way. So we've got to the position at the moment, although we're trying to move out a bit for BVLOS drone operations, that a lot is directed into a temporary danger area. So therefore, BVLOS operations are in effect classed as a hazardous activity. And needs protecting and segregating, or what I should say is other airspace users need segregating from the airspace to protect their operations, whether they're flying across country, military jets flying at low level, whatever it may be. It is a very blunt instrument in that, in very broad terms, the only aircraft or air system that can be within that piece of airspace is the one that we want to protect, i.e. in this case, if we're talking that way, a BVLOS drone. And basically forbids, probably a strong word, but stops other aircraft, so in general aviation, low-level, paragliders, microlights, military low-level, helicopters, from entering that piece of airspace. So it is a blunt instrument in that it totally segregates the activity. From a GA perspective, it's seen as a wall across areas they normally operate and therefore isn't ideal. For the operator operating within it, it's a very defined area without which they can't stray. So it sort of worked. It worked on Project 𝗕𝗓𝗄, but did mean a huge amount of work in terms of engaging with other airspace users to convince them that A, it was safe, which is the most important thing, and B, not quite the hindrance it could be, because you can put in lots of mitigations. I think that's the best way to put it. In terms of temporary reserved airspace, it's slightly more flexible. And what I must say actually is, in terms of SUA, so special use airspace, one of the overriding factors is the flexible use of that airspace. That's really, really key. And clearly safety. So, going back to temporary reserved area, it can be similar in effect in design to a TDA, but the essence being on the more flexible use side, in that there could be the allowance, depending on the air traffic management procedures put in place, to allow other traffic into that piece of airspace. Whether it's at the same time or at the same place as a BVLOS drone, probably not, but it would allow activity potentially outside of when BVLOS activity was happening without a carte blanche, you shall not enter. So, and that's pretty much where we're going with the Civil Aviation Authority at the moment, routing the TRA route to provide that more flexible use of airspace. It sort of works, but there are limitations, because you don't necessarily, as I found out last week, don't necessarily have to have an ANSP involved in that, but you do have to have the ability to, in effect, manage the airspace. And that could be as simple as one aircraft at a time. But also it allows for things like Cat A aircraft to enter a TRA to enable them to do operational stuff. So it could be NPAS operations, SAR, HEMS, anybody who's on Cat A. So it's the management of the airspace in that way, in that if, for instance, you were flying a quadcopter on BVLOS, you get a call from NPAS, say, we've got an operation to come into your airspace. Can you advise us when you're on the deck, fundamentally? And so it would still be done in a very black and white way. But at least there's a management of the airspace and the flexibility for other aircraft to use it. So that's where we're going. One of the issues is this starts to blur the line between ATM and UTM and what regulations need to be applied. I think this is a vexing matter at the CA at the moment. That's my view. I know it's being looked at and addressed, but fundamentally, what ATM regulation can you apply to a UAS operating in a TRA? It differs, I think, between whether you're flying a quadcopter or a fixed-wing UAS, and there is a difference between the two, clearly. And also, coming back to the very sticky subject of electronic conspicuity and what a form of electronic conspicuity needs to be carried. But also the normal things that are taken into account in ATM. So what are the separation standards? Is there actually a provision of an air traffic service? Are we following different rules of the air to what we have defined within the air navigation order at the moment? So a whole world of problems. So the TRA is a sort of stepping stone. I think it's a really painful stepping stone, personally. And in my personal opinion, we should move beyond that and go straight towards, as quick as possible, the final position laid out in the airspace modernisation strategy of basically Class G, you are detecting and avoiding everybody and anybody, with whichever form of electronic conspicuity you can suck in, and use that to segregate. So I beg your pardon, wrong word. Separate yourself from other airspace users. So clearly not see and avoid from a BVLOS perspective, but a combination of the two for both crewed and uncrewed aircraft to in effect self-deconflict from other airspace users in Class G. I think that's where all the energy should be going personally, because that's what we're aiming for. Clearly, the technical side to that in the provision of TSB and FIS-B is some way in coming yet, but companies are working on that. As we've seen with around Goodwood, and I won't mention any companies, but a lot of work going on behalf of the CA to show how TSB and FIS-B can work within these airspace constructs, either TRA in particular or TSA, which I'll come to in a second. Temporary segregated area is what we haven't covered yet. From my experience, it's of use and utilisation within existing airspace. And a classic example was, and I don't think anybody will mind me saying, so under Project 𝗬𝗏𝗧, we operated in and out of both Aberdeen CTZ and Edinburgh CTZ to get to hospitals with drones, and so temporary segregated airspace, which is in effect very similar to temporary reserved airspace, was utilised and pushed for us by the Civil Aviation Authority, in both Aberdeen and Edinburgh traffic units were brilliant in both those aspects in making that happen. So temporary segregated airspace is similar to TRA, but from my experience, utilised within existing controlled airspace, in that case, Class D. The one thing I'll just cover on the areas or types of airspace we talked about, but it's not actually a type of airspace, is a transponder mandatory zone. So this comes under a different SARG policy for the establishment of, and so it isn't a form of airspace in itself. It is an area within which, as the name suggests, a certain level of transponder or electronic conspicuity is required to enable safe operations within that particular area. And that could be in that fact it enhances situation awareness for ACAS, TCAS users, or it could be enhancing situation awareness for ANSPs providing a service in that specific area. So TMZ is an interesting one, and I literally read the policy on that not half an hour ago, and to be honest, I probably should have read it about 2 years ago. It's really a bit of an eye-opener, and it has been talked about as a bit of a panacea for BVLOS operations and integration, and having read the definition of it properly, I think it probably is. Because what it doesn't do is then do any form of segregation, but it does mean mandatory carriage of electronic conspicuity, which, as I've already mentioned, feeds into the end game of the airspace modernisation strategy in Class G. So suddenly I've become a big fan of TMZs.
Good. Thank you for that overview. It really clarifies the different acronyms, and hopefully I will still remember all those in the correct order.
Me too.
So I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is I'm not going to talk about TDA, I'm going to talk about the TRAs that are the tool used at the moment by the CA for the trials, for example. You mentioned that it was challenging to define the role of the entity that is doing traffic management in a way, and to what extent it had to adhere to the level of an ANSP or not. And from my perspective, which is not necessarily a very good perspective, but my understanding is that the trials at the moment are taking place in locations where actually there is very limited request for entry into the restricted areas. We're talking about a few requests per week, if not month. Therefore, I mean, why do we need a very cumbersome process when possibly a phone call and just, grounding the drone operation, once a week or once a month is not the end of the world. So a phone call, grounding of operation, we start from there. And then as we grow, we may have some more elaborate solutions. But, what do you think? I mean, am I too simplistic here? Are there really any issues in terms of starting from a low level in a way?
It's a good question, Alice, and so it's not very well defined within SUA policy about what the requirements for what the requirements for airspace management and the TRA actually are. So to be perfectly honest, I've read it as you need an ANSP involved in it to manage the airspace with the appropriate level of understanding and skill level and certification to provide ANSP-like services or procedural methods of deconfliction, which, of course, generally speaking, requires an air traffic license. It's sort of been highlighted to me within the last couple of weeks that is not necessarily the case. You don't necessarily need an ANSP involved. The limitation with having an ANSP is if you then want to go and set up a TRA somewhere in the middle of the country in Class G airspace, and you did need an ANSP, then clearly you need an ANSP that A is willing to be involved and B may require a commercial feedback for that provision of service, and understandably so. And therefore, if you haven't got that, that could be a limitation. As I say, with it very recently, it's sort of been highlighted to me, you don't actually need to have an ANSP, but you do have air traffic management of that piece of airspace. And therein lies the difficulty is, to me, air traffic management means you've got an air traffic controller or an ANSP monitoring the airspace. It seems to be the CA view that air traffic management could be, as you suggest, somebody on the end of a phone and going back to the analogy I used earlier, being there whilst BVLOS operations are going on and NPAS ring up and say, we need to get Police 09 into your piece of airspace within the next 5 minutes. Can you get your aircraft on the deck? So you're right. It could be as simplistic as that. I think it can be as simplistic as that with prior agreements in terms of letters of agreement and things between the operators. That, in my mind, is all entirely achievable and all achievable without an ANSP on side. So I agree. The wording in the SUA policy could do with redefining a little bit to ensure that there's a clear space between what actually is provided. Is it air traffic management in terms of somebody being on the end of a phone, or is it air traffic management in the proper sense of the word, which involves the whole suite of air traffic management? So there is the difficulty, but both can work with the required resource, fundamentally. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, it makes sense. And maybe it may be that initially the idea was, yes, an ANSP, because that's what people are used to. But as we progress and realize that actually there is very limited traffic to monitor, maybe we will collectively realize that having a real in the sense of approved ANSP with an approved air traffic controller who can only follow the air traffic control code is not necessary considering the traffic to monitor at hand. I mean, it's not, you don't have a commercial aircraft in and out every minute, right? It's much more, it's a much smaller risk and smaller traffic. So maybe collectively we realize that we can do with less assurance than that level. We'll see.
Yeah, and this sort of ties in very briefly, sorry, Annalise, this ties in with
Yep.
my sudden desire for TMZs, in that you can provide, with a TMZ, you could provide the level of safety with appropriate mitigations, and there could be a whole host of those, but without any requirement for an ANSP, and without any requirement for another restriction of airspace such as TRA, in my mind. That is the end game of the airspace modernisation strategy, but how we get there is the difficulty.
Then I have a question for you on the TMZ. So a TMZ is an area that is not particularly segregated, but where if you want to enter into that airspace, you must be equipped with a specific set of equipment so that you become conspicuous and you have the famous known traffic environment picture. So it's perfect because then that known traffic environment picture is made available, and we can start deconflict and share the airspace. The challenge I have, though, is that I understand that the TMZ also requires, in terms of process, an airspace change proposal as per CAP 1616. And also, so on theory, it's much better, you don't segregate. The problem is, if you are a drone operator doing a data capture in a specific area, then of course it's not possible to set up a CAP 1616 process because it takes several months. And so it's just not viable, not economical. So 2 questions here. 1, am I correct in understanding that it does require an ACP that would take months? 2, if that is the case, do you see organizations doing a little bit like a traffic controller, but I don't know what the name should be for it, but imagine over a certain area, like maybe over a certain city, I don't know, an organization, maybe an operator or something else, being the sponsor of a TMZ, and then doing that role of ANSP might be a big word, but maybe the local airfield or the local aerodrome doing that traffic management. What do you think of that? So 2 questions here, and what do you think of the idea?
Yeah, and you're right, Anne-Lise. They're both very valid questions, and both of which I know there's ongoing discussions about. Again, no names, no pack drill, but stuff is going on, particularly about the second bit, about another role other than that code. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So, in answer to the first question about establishment of TMZs, having read the TMZ, the policy, the SARG policy for establishment of TMZ, I'm not entirely clear, to be honest. You do have to start with this DAP 1916 statement of need to propose the activity, which I'm sort of kind of assuming will then lead into the CAP 1616 process. It's a question I think we need to clarify with the Civil Aviation Authority and see if that is the case. Now, if it is the case, then yes, you're right. It will become under, I assume, a permanent change of airspace, which we all know is a lengthy and very complicated process. But the reason I'm not entirely sure is because we're not talking about segregated airspace. So therefore, the impact on other airspaces users is more limited. Because we're not segregating it, we're just asking people to carry a level of electronic conspicuity. So we need to ask the question. I'm in doubt about it, what it actually needs to create just a TMZ. In pragmatic terms, you think it'd be a much simpler process because clearly to establish a permanent piece of airspace involves many, many factors, primarily safety, clearly, effect on other airspace users, the environmental issues. All those factors have to come into play. Does that apply to something which isn't a segregated airspace, won't necessarily affect traffic patterns, etc., etc.? So it's an interesting question, and I'll be really upfront with you. I don't know the answer. I think it's a good question for the Civil Aviation Authority, though. I still see TMZ as the way ahead, though. Remind me the second question, please, Anne-Lise.
So the second question was whether there could be a route, assuming we can set up TMZ relatively rapidly, where we also have an entity, and I don't know how to describe it because ANSP could be a way, or an entity managing the uncrewed traffic in a way, which could be in a specific area, if you see that as an option, because a single drone operator will probably find it completely non-viable, economically speaking, to be a sponsor of a TMZ, especially if they have only one operation every month or equivalent. So, do you see that as an option? That we have a form of mini, where there is enough traffic, a mini entity somewhere above a city or equivalent.
Yeah, yes is the answer. So we've looked at one extreme, which is a guy on the end of a phone receiving a telephone call from ARPAS, MRC, the RCC or whatever, saying we need to get a aircraft into airspace straight away. Get your drones on the ground. We'll come in. We know there's nothing to hit. So that's the one extreme, and is a form of air traffic management itself. Clearly, the other end of the arc is a fully qualified, probably radar qualified ATCO, actually providing an air traffic service with appropriate levels of electronic conspicuity. But what we're talking about here then is probably in Class G, a largish area, monitoring both ATM and UTM, hopefully with a unified form of electronic conspicuity, and managing that traffic. That has been proposed for a TRA, which is under consideration at the moment, and it has caused a level of angst, I think, within the ATM element of it, of the CA, in that there is no such role at the moment. So it needs defining. Is it a possibility to have somewhere in that halfway house where somebody is monitoring ATM and UTM, and, if appropriate, providing a form of air traffic service? Also yet to be decided. The other thing about that is that, going back to what I was talking about before, as TRA is seen as a stepping stone towards fully integrated BVLOS without the need for an ANSP in Class G, is it something that we really want to get wrapped massively around the axle about, when it's actually not going to feed into the end product of Class G autonomous operations? Unfortunately, I don't think there's any option but to get wrapped around the axle about it. But I think we just need to, in the broader perspective, keep it in perspective about how is that feeding the end game. And in reality, how much deconfliction can you do between ATM and UTM if, as is trying to be set up in the country, you have an area of for primarily UTM operations, which could be operating numerous drones at the same time, apologies, UAS, in delivery of goods and services, i.e. lots of things whizzing around below 500 feet, which if you're at 3,000 feet and on a cross-country flight, are you actually all that bothered? So these are big questions which I don't have the answer to. In answer to your question, should there be somebody involved in that process in air traffic management in big handfuls or actual provision of ATS? Yes, there probably should be at the moment. Are we going to get there in the near future? Probably not.
But I would add 2 points, and then you feel free to comment on it. I would say that, one, we see some progress. That is, we were just in TDA, it was taking forever, and now there are more options considered, and it's making progress, even if the progress are not as as fast and iterative as we would like. There is also a certain openness to considering new ideas that are not purely being a qualified ANSP, qualified air traffic controller, etc. And then the other point I wanted to make is that we're talking here about segregation of airspace for BVLOS operations in fully integrated airspace, so in higher risk, in a way, airspace, maybe ARC-C or D if we speak under SORA terms. So just for everyone, it doesn't mean that it's the only option. I remind everyone that at the other end of the spectrum, there is atypical which is 𝗲𝗃 low risk. And that portion of airspace and BVLOS in that kind of airspace has started and will be growing over time. So just to remind everyone that there are
Yeah.
two ends to the same story.
Yeah, it's a good point actually, and I hadn't touched on atypical. I think it's too limited at the moment. There's a lot of scope for atypical, and going back to, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, a UTM, a classic UTM type operation, is in my mind atypical. If it's below 400 feet, you can never rule out what aircraft are below 400 feet, but fundamentally, in terms of the A&O, nothing much should be plodding around below 400 feet or 500 feet. But clearly there are exceptions to that in terms of military low-level traffic. And as we talked about, HEMS, SAR and police helicopter operations. But I see you're right, I see a much bigger use of atypical as opposed to pure UTM as we would see in Europe. Maritime areas, one of the companies I work for does a huge amount of flying across the North Sea. Do we see any conflictors outside of known traffic under a service of an air traffic unit? No, not really. No, there's very little. I can't carte blanche say there is no GA out there, but there isn't a lot compared with overland. So in terms of risk, the risk is massively reduced in a maritime area. And if you're in receipt of a form of service or something, it's in my mind it's ripe for a look at in terms of atypical. A lot more stuff could be happening in a maritime environment. But you're right. I think atypical is something that we should be grasping more firmly.
So we agree that maritime is also a very good candidate for atypical, and in a way, I guess we'll progress on both ends, and both ends will be very informative, as you mentioned, in terms of better qualifying airspace and getting more access together with the other airspace users.
Yeah, I quite agree. I mean, and as I started right at the beginning, I'm working quite a lot within the industry. The desire is to see integrated BVLOS one way or another without lengthy airspace change proposals as quick as possible. It's really limiting commercially. If commercial companies are having requests from potential customers saying, "Can you do this in 2 weeks' time?" and say, "No, but we can do it in 6 months' time," it's not much of a business proposition. So, in summary, I think the whole industry wants to see a much quicker but safe operation rolled out across the UK as soon as possible. They don't give a monkey's what the airspace is called. We have too many different types of airspace, which, as the purpose of the discussion is to try and get some clarity on that. I don't think anybody cares what it's called, but as long as something is in there which enables quick reaction, commercial activity in safe airspace, which could be or might be atypical, might be fully integrated, the sooner that happens, the better, I think.
So, Smudger, thank you for walking us through, the different types of airspace segregation. Even for me, to be honest, it's super useful. I systematically have to reopen my files to remember the different types of segregation in which airspace. We've identified a few ways for progress, for iteration. I think we should ask the question whether a TMZ will absolutely require an ACP or not. That would be a great opportunity if one of the outcomes of the thought process is that no, not necessarily. It would be a great outcome. And then, of course, as we mentioned, progressing in atypical in addition to fully integrated so that we can eat the cake on both ends.
Yeah,
Anything
I
else
quite
you
agree.
would like to?
Yeah. I think the really key thing is, which hasn't come up in the conversation, is a lot of the reason why the airspace bit is so complicated at the moment is about the understanding and implementation of detect and avoid for BVLOS. it's really, really key, and that's where I have got a lot of sympathy with the Civil Aviation Authority, because it is key. But it does come back down also to an electronic conspicuity mandate of some form, because without the two, then you can't get the detect and avoid. So it's a really key subject. It would be key for TMZ, but all of it is achievable. The technology is there. At the DroneX last week, the amount of people who are showing incredible pieces of kit which will enable what we want to achieve as a BVLOS industry tomorrow, quite honestly. We just need regulation to catch up, I think.
So we're entering into politically sensitive territory, which is electronic conspicuity mandate. So it's a very personal perception and opinion. I think EC is not only a technical issue, it's a political issue. And yes, there are solutions out there, but I think we still need to test them properly, making sure that they work in real life environment. It's step number one before considering mandating it. And on the mandate, I don't know, the reality that there is no mandate in Europe. I mean, in some countries, yes, in many other countries, no. So I don't know. What I do know is that I want to see progress regardless of a mandate. I think it's a bad dependency for the industry. I want progress not requiring a mandate, because nobody knows whether it will happen in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, or never. We have no idea. And so what I really want is progress without it. Maybe you have a different opinion. I mean, it's okay in TMZ because it's only in TMZ, but I don't want to be a hostage, if you want, to a decision that we don't control.
No, you're right, and which is why I think TMZ is the answer, because clearly a mandate is unpalatable to a lot of people. To be perfectly honest, from my point of view, I don't see the argument against it from a safety perspective. Why wouldn't you want to know about other traffic in your vicinity, or at least have situational awareness of it? But clearly, there is a cost element to that, and that is a difficult one to answer. If people are being mandated to go out and buy a piece of equipment which they don't really want and it's going to cost them money, that's a difficult sell. So the key bit is, well, it enhances safety, and it will enhance everybody's safety. So therein lies the challenge with that. But it always does all fit back into the detect and avoid bit about how that is enabled, which is really, really key, again, in terms of the longer term, the airspace modernisation strategy.
To a certain extent, we'll have a better view on on acceptability of the mandate after the results of the ongoing EC conspicuity are made available, because it might be that the overall group of airspace users just say to the CI, get on with it, or look, we're not interested, or we don't believe the solution is correct or is cost effective or whatever. So let's see, maybe we will have a better view on the state of play in a few months' time. I mean, honestly, for me, of course, as ARPAS, yes, of course, I prefer a mandate as opposed to no mandate. But I'm just a realist here. I mean, I just want to make sure that we can make progress within a realistic timeline. That's really what I'm after.
Yeah, I quite agree, and which is why TMZ is a potential mitigation to basically mandate throughout the whole of the UK airspace. That is a sort of part of the balancing act. But also there has to be an appetite within government and the Department of Transport to feed down to civil aviation about what is wanted for the state as a whole. And again, I have a bit of sympathy with the CA in that they're working within the regulations themselves, or the boundaries provided by the Department of Transport, which clearly feeds down from the government of the day. So that has to be a known, or they have to have an agreement what they want to achieve from it as for the nation, and feed that down through the Department of Transport to the Civil Aviation Authority and to enact it. So it needs that backing and that appetite to back it in the first place. Bigger picture stuff.
Yep. So at least thanks to you, we have a better understanding of the picture. So, thank you very much for your time, for your explanations. Much appreciated. And all the best with all your, airspace change activities.
Thank you, Rashid. Well, I always keep saying, everybody, the sooner it gets easier and I don't have to do airspace change proposals, I can retire. So that's my real driver, Anne-Lise.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Smudger.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.